We help empower our communities to make decisions about their green infrastructure by taking control of AI and using it to our benefit instead of it being used against us by decision makers who aren't really concerned about what happens to us.
I'm Justin Worland. I'm a senior correspondent at Time, where I write about climate and energy. I write about all things climate and energy, but a big part of my job is spending time on the road in communities and learning about the impact of employment and green employment, as one might call it, on communities. And of course, this has been a big topic for the last several years. So great to be here with Donnel.
Yeah, I'm the president of the Justin Worland Fan Club. He's been doing incredible work writing about the intersection of climate and wealth building and job creation and underserved communities globally. Well, you wrote a piece on Canada and what we can learn from them in the US. That was
but
really
inspired by the conversation that we had in Huntsville
in
last
Alabama.
year. That was sort of the thread that led to that story in Canada. So
that's great.
So thank you for that.
Yeah. I'm the CEO of a company called BlocPower. We're a startup. We focus on leveraging capital that's interested in investing in green infrastructure and focusing it on transforming brown infrastructure, dirty infrastructure in low-income communities, and creating jobs and community ownership as a part of that. And so, yeah, really excited to be here.
Maybe, I feel like maybe we should just start really broadly and talk a little bit about where you see the future of quote unquote green jobs, if you want to call it that, but what do you see on the landscape?
How candid can we be in this candid conversation?
Did the last conversation,
How candid?
Let's see if we can beat them. Let's see if we can be more candid.
So before I started BlocPower, I was a senior staffer on both Obama campaigns, and in between was a outside liaison between the Department of Energy and a bunch of labor union pension funds that had $90 billion that they wanted to co-invest in green infrastructure and green investments in exchange for those jobs being union jobs, right? So they're like, look, we're gonna invest our labor union pension funds, but we want all of these jobs that we create going building to building, installing solar panels, putting in insulation. We want all of these jobs to be green jobs, but we want them to be union jobs, like we want them to sign up with the union. And that was the deal, frankly, that Obama and really then Vice President Biden had this thing called the Middle Class Task Force, where the unions were reporting to Vice President Biden to run this. And this was part of the 2009 stimulus, where we had $80 billion that we were investing in green energy. And none of that stuff worked, basically, candidly. So here we are 10 years later. We have a massive infrastructure bill. We have a massive CHIPS bill, which no one talks about. We have the Inflation Reduction Act that has at least, depending on who's asking, $300 to $500 billion to go into green infrastructure, with about half of it focused on low-income communities. And I lay sleepless at night worried that we're gonna get the same missed opportunities now that we had 10 years ago during the Obama administration. We have this opportunity, a second bite at the apple, to really do a transformative green infrastructure program for our country. We may lose this election in November. We may win it, but we might lose it. And you can see at the RNC, Trump specifically said he's gonna roll back the Green New Scam. So we're in this moment where, on the one hand, you have literally $1 trillion that we can leverage and invest in greening low-income communities, all the things that we've been talking about to build wealth, create jobs, create health, transform these communities forever. And we may lose all of it in 5 months. And so I think the question for all of us here is, what do we do with this opportunity? How do we make sure some of that money, even if it's a good $300 billion, how do we get that out to our communities between now and November, or between now and the end of the year? And we can, and frankly, that's where we are, and it's hard for me to focus on anything else.
I know this is supposed to be a conversation, but I like
candid conversation.
Candid conversation. I'll say some things, but I do just want to ask you. But how do we do that, or how do you do that in the next?
How will we do that?
Yeah.
Did you see the movie Oppenheimer?
Yeah.
Did you guys see Oppenheimer?
Yeah.
Okay, so it was a national commitment to try and figure out how to build the atomic bomb, right?
Yeah.
And so they brought in all these physicists, but they created this infrastructure of national R&D laboratories to like research and build a bomb. And so there was one in Tennessee called Oak Ridge. There was whichever one out west where they actually blew the bomb up. There's another one in Berkeley. There's these national research laboratories all over America. And a lot of them still focus on nuclear energy, but a lot of them, their 100% focus is on renewable energy.
Yeah.
Or how do we bring quantum computing to make it accessible to low-income communities? And these national laboratories are bipartisan, and they can very easily absorb some of this $1 trillion that's like sitting right here in DC, doing nothing in the agency bank accounts. And they can absorb that money into that bipartisan infrastructure, and they can rapidly distribute it. And it allows the federal government to cut through the kind of red tape that has handcuffed the green infrastructure movement from being delivered, and like that's the specific way you can do it. And so that's a conversation with folks in Congress and at the Department of Energy and the EPA and the Department of Transportation around how to move that money out over the next 4 or 5 months.
Yeah. I want to pick up on the thread you mentioned. I didn't watch the RNC. It's not part of my job.
You missed out.
So I decided not to do that.
It was nutritious, really.
But I've heard a lot of those talking points. Like you hear a lot of those talking points on the ground in communities. And one of the things that I'm often, it's the thing that keeps me up at night in some ways is how do people on the ground in communities understand what's happening with this transition, especially in places, energy communities, legacy auto communities where they're used to really good union jobs that paid well, that had ups and downs but were relatively consistent, and you have this huge energy that comes in with new investment, but you get, and here's the candid part, you get, the president flies in and says, well, we're creating jobs, or the governor comes and says, we're creating jobs. But they say, well, yeah, but we also see that our other jobs and the old infrastructure maybe are threatened. And so how do people understand what the future of green jobs looks like? And how do we make sure that the jobs that are created are good jobs? And to my mind, like, that is the political economy question that's central to making all of this stuff last past the next president, whoever that might be.
Boy, I'm gonna try to give you another real answer. Candidly, look, like working communities of all colors, white communities in Appalachia, on the south side of Chicago or in Boston, indigenous communities, black and brown communities. Too often lots of decisions on our infrastructure and our local economies are made by folks not from those communities. They're made by policy and financial elites, right? And so, whether it's Wall Street or private equity or Silicon Valley from an industry side, like you have folks who are disconnected from these communities and really don't give a crap about these communities, who are making decisions that impact them. So if you look at AI, if you look at the green infrastructure revolution, like who are the folks that are going to make decisions and who's going to decide what are acceptable impacts for working people from the green revolution or the AI revolution, right? That's one part. And so folks are rightfully skeptical that they haven't had the level of participation and engagement. On the other hand, it is really complicated to make decisions about AI and green infrastructure. And you have to get into some complicated like data science stuff that very small percentages of people can understand. In order to, I'm gonna support the Biden administration here for a second. They have this $1 trillion in their bank accounts, but they have lots of regulations and red tape that governs how they can allocate and distribute that money. Like they can't hand it out willy-nilly. Like there has to be a protocol and a set of RFPs and processes. And in those RFPs, you have to have a really high level of electrical engineering, mechanical engineering that meets the threshold of basically running a nuclear power plant. So like literally, like in order to get a grant from the US Department of Energy, you have to submit an application and a proposal that is pretty much the same from a technical perspective as if you were going to build a small nuclear power plant in your yard. So when you go into our communities, do we have those kind of technical resources? The answer is no. So I think that there's an opportunity to really use generative AI in particular. Generative AI is in the news because they've built a large language model. They've basically stolen all of the language from all over the internet and sucked it into their new self-supervising AI engine, which is a black box that just kind of reads and absorbs and structures all of the data and all the language that they've stolen from all the websites, whether it's the Times website or Time Magazine's website or Reddit or Facebook. They've taken all the data, they build a model of the entire English language, and the AI model starts to predict the ends of sentences and how to answer sentences and questions based on the model. So what we've spent 7 years building is a large infrastructure model. So we've got digital twins of every building in America, which we got from these national research laboratories that built the atomic bomb 50 years ago. We've been working with them for several years to build an infrastructure model of all of the real estate assets in America and all of the infrastructure in America, and to use generative AI to make recommendations about how to green each individual building and piece of infrastructure. So you have a situation where the US Department of Energy has, a couple $100 million to install solar in indigenous Native American communities. They put out the money for RFP, not a single community responds because it's too complicated and expensive, and who has $200,000 to pay an engineer to write a proposal that's unlikely to be funded? So how do you use this generative AI model of a large green infrastructure model that can make recommendations? Are you on this reservation? Well, we have satellite data and property data on every single building and every single asset on your reservation. And you can ask the AI model to write that proposal to the US Department of Energy for you. And it very quickly can, and spit out that proposal. You send that in and maybe you win the money, maybe you don't. But by reducing the cost of our community to play this game, we can help, I hate the word empower, but I'm tired. We help empower our communities to make decisions about their green infrastructure by taking control of AI and using it to our benefit instead of it being used against us by decision makers who aren't really concerned about what happens to us. Does that make sense?
Oh no, it makes a lot of sense. It gets to some of the conversation happening before about challenging the scale, but also being at a community level. Which of course, this is what you do. You're at a community level, and so it makes total sense.
Yeah, they were talking about impact investing, and I've been talking about the government, but the same thing applies to capital markets, right? If you have data on all the real estate assets in America, and you have an AI algorithm to tell you how to green the size of equipment, the type of equipment, how to install it, what those costs should be, what the energy impact would be, the emissions impact, and what the health and pollution reduction impact could be. You can take that data and that set of recommendations, you can take it and ask for a grant from the federal government, but you can also take it to a private equity firm and say if you work with us to install EV charging stations across LA, which is one of our projects, we think you can make a 75% internal rate of return. That's higher than most middle market private equity firms are able to do now. And so when you have the data in a granular way combined with the model, we think it can empower communities to not only negotiate and navigate, with the government side, but also with capital markets. And so that's what we think the unlock can really be. But we only have 90 days to really use all the stuff. So
yeah, I'm curious. I think one of the things I see on the ground oftentimes is you've got all of the, you're talking about it. You've got all of these federal programs, state programs, sometimes private, philanthropic capital, and all willing to fund certain things that are all important, say a job training program. And then you have a bunch of people who can't take 3 months off work to do the job training program. So you've got this program that nobody uses. Nobody really wants to step in and sort of help connect the dots, right, to make all that happen. I guess I'm curious, working on in communities, how do you think about some of those challenges of actually connecting dots on the ground, and then because you go to the folks in Silicon Valley, which totally get that, but what about the sort of people who could help, who want to help, but maybe are just not seeing what's happening on the ground and figuring out how to connect it?
Who, philanthropists and impact investors?
Well, yeah, that's probably time for some more candid thoughts.
Well, I can't be too candid about philanthropists and impact investors. Jeff Bezos gave us $5 million to build out our AI model.
Yeah.
And that's a really example to me of smart philanthropy at scale. He's like, here's $5 million. If you can build a model that can influence, $1 trillion of green infrastructure investments with this $5 million, that's a good bet. Now he's like a CEO or ex-CEO, and he's a venture capitalist. And then on the side, he and his fiance, Lauren, do impact investments or impact philanthropy. So he has that lens across all three. But I do think, really getting clear on what's possible in the moment that we're in, and really focusing on place-based. One of the comments that was made, I think, from Discover was like, hey, we're focused on the south side of Chicago. We're going to try to drive some transformation there. Because it's place-based, and you can say, who are all the people on the south side? Who are all the infrastructure and real estate assets on the south side? What's possible from an impact standpoint across health, job creation, wealth building, emissions reduction? Because it's place-based and it's focused, that gives you an opportunity to really have an impact. And then you can get into quantitative and qualitative scenario projections of what that impact could be. So you can then move the levels. So you can say, you can move the toggles, right? You can be like, all right, we're on the south side of Chicago. I really want to decrease gang violence. And so I'm going to invest in training and hiring, like you said, training and hiring gang members on the south side of Chicago to reduce gang violence. Or you can look at the south side of Chicago and say, I want to reduce the maximum amount of emissions on the south side of Chicago that's possible. So let's look at transportation, let's look at the buildings and figure out how to do that. Or you could say, I want to reduce childhood asthma on the south side of Chicago because it's a huge problem, right? And so where are all the buildings that burn oil? Where are all the buildings that are trapping pollution and sucking it in from the local roadways and recirculating it inside the school or the library or their apartment complex and driving high rates of asthma? Let's target our philanthropy towards those buildings so that we can get that type of outcome. And so to me, that's how you can use a data model and AI and a place-based initiative to truly game plan the kinds of impact that philanthropists and impact investors want to have.
Yeah. I think I started this conversation talking about green jobs, quote unquote, using that phrase green jobs, which I think was definitely more in vogue during your time in the Obama White House than it is now. And it's interesting we go here.
Because it didn't work.
Right.
So everyone moved away from it and we don't talk about green jobs anymore. We're talking about this new thing. We're talking about workforce or whatever the branding is now.
But I'm curious. I mean, so finishing your comments here, you're talking about something that there's a little bit of green in there, and of course you call BlocPower a climate tech company, but the language has changed, and I guess from my experience, people on the ground definitely are not in communities are not thinking in those terms first, at least. But I guess for me, it's something I'm always grappling with. What's the best way to explain this so that people understand the connection to climate and to green issues, because that's really important, but also not letting people lose sight of the important element of this that is community oriented.
Right. Let me try this in 60 seconds. I know we're short on time. We're doing a project on the south side of Chicago, and one in LA, and one in the Bronx that I think are useful. So when we borrow capital from Goldman Sachs and Microsoft, we may say hey, can we use $20 million from our credit line with you guys because we want to do green infrastructure in these 3 cities. We want to install EV charging stations in LA. We want to do a workforce program in Chicago. We want to reduce asthma in the Bronx, which has the highest childhood asthma rates in America. When we borrow that $20 million from Goldman, we put it into a special purpose entity, which is a fancy name for a holding company that's going to own that capital, that's going to pay the workers, buy the equipment for the green infrastructure project, and own the financial returns generated from those investments in that project. So who owns that holding company? It's us, and it's Goldman and Microsoft. We think if you extend that ownership to the actual community members, now you can come in talking about green jobs or job print, whatever. But what you're really talking about is ownership and wealth building in the green economy and the AI transition. Because hey, we're going to take 7-8% of this holding company that's going to own all the solar panels on the south side, right? That's going to own all the EV charging stations in LA, and we're going to distribute that to the Uber and Lyft drivers who are going to use those charging stations. So now they have a financial incentive to use the charging stations because they own and operate the charging stations. And even if Uber and Lyft won't claim them as employees, they're now worker owners of a community green infrastructure project that generates 75% returns for our private equity investors, but also should be able to generate some wealth for those Uber and Lyft drivers who are now co-owners of green infrastructure. So I think when you come in talking about ownership of community green infrastructure assets, it can solve lots of the problems around, because folks are interested in a way out and how to change their circumstances, and ownership of the green economy and green careers in the green economy can be a way out.
I mean, as you know, I love this idea that going from talking about jobs, which oftentimes is a promise that isn't fulfilled, to talking about ownership is just a complete transformation. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you both for the candid conversation. I see there is a question immediately. So
this isn't being recorded, right? So
it is being recorded.
Fine to be candid.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It is being recorded as you ask your questions.
My name is Casey Bell. I work at a nonprofit CDFI, Pacific Community Ventures, in California. We're primarily a small business lender, and I really want to double click on good green jobs and ownership in communities. Because I think when we talk about green infrastructure investment, what we are really mobilizing from the policy lever and from the investment lever perspective are investments in workforce development and the availability of capital for project development. But what we're observing in our work is that 98% of the businesses that are necessary to do the installation of technology are small businesses. They've been through a pandemic. They have been through a supply chain crisis. They have been through inflation and the rising cost of equipment. And I really appreciate that you're up at night worrying about missed opportunities from the current infrastructure investment. I am too, because when we look at ownership in communities and making sure that economic development benefits, not just environmental benefits, don't leak from communities of color, what are the levers that we can leverage to stabilize small business, to be full participants in the climate economy?
Yeah, I mean, we spent a lot of time thinking about this because our business doesn't work unless we have a really robust national network of small businesses and construction companies who are mom and pop construction companies, a lot of baby boomers, a lot of whom are actually looking to retire. They're like, you know what, pandemic was rough. I'm 70-something years old. Like my president, Joe Breezy, we're done. We're ready to retire. And so what we found is that, developing a financial product that underwrites to the working capital needs of small business borrowers, but also to the green infrastructure project investment opportunities of the larger project, and having both be parts of the underwriting for a small business loan, may be a path forward. And so we sent $250,000 to one of our partners on this EV charging project in LA that we're doing for all the Uber and Lyft drivers, who, by the way, live in working class communities, which is what we've been talking about. They live in the same communities that we would never say, well, you should go put an EV in this broke, poor, low income neighborhood in Los Angeles because these people don't own EVs. But Uber and Lyft drivers are going to be the largest fleet of electric vehicles in the world. And they all live in low-income communities, and they need to be able to charge up their electric vehicles overnight, just like you and I do, right? And so then with the small business installer, what we do is you take a look at the working capital needs of the small business borrower itself from a traditional underwriting standpoint. But then you also incorporate the broader green infrastructure project finance financial returns for them as a vendor on that project. And then you figure out how to wrap both of those underwriting criteria in a working capital credit line. And so we've found that that's been a way to potentially approach it. And then, looking to work with private equity and going to ask Damien for some money to go buy up some of these businesses from baby boomers who want to retire and, transition them to being owned and operated by younger folks who are working people from communities of color or white working folks who are ready to own and operate these construction companies.
We are at time and there is lunch outside, but we are now 2 for 2 for very candid conversations. So thank you both for this.